first of all, it's really great to have Phil down here today. I mean, I've known about this project for decades, to be honest, and we've all been waiting for the book to come out, and it's just wonderful it has. I just wanted to say one thing about the history, which I found really interesting throughout the whole period I've known about Peter Paynter. So I know about through being involved in the anarchist movement in the 1980s, but I also knew about him because my nan used to talk about him. So he is part of East London folklore, if not wider. And so what I've discovered through doing history over the years is a number of things that these onion skins, that you look on the outside and you see something, you look deeper. And certainly from what I've learned from Phil's talk in 2008 and recently for reading the book is that there are many onion skins to this story, and I hope he's going to unfold some of that for us now.
Yes, thanks, Roger. And I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming tonight, because looking out, it's very reassuring to see faces looking back at me. It'd be a bit embarrassing at the book launch if nobody comes. Just briefly about those two films, just about every fact that was packed into the voiceover on that Pathé newsreel of the real event was wrong. And the second film was absolutely correct. Probably the best film on Peter the Painter in a perverse way is a film called The Siege of Sydney Street, filmed on location in Dublin, which was released in 1960. It was filmed in Dublin because everything in the East End has been knocked down virtually. And one of the great scenes in that is when this bulldog Drummond type detective who is trying to track down Peter the Painter goes into the pub opposite the Anarchist club and tries to pump the barman for information about what's happening over the road. The barman says, "Oh, there's foreigners over there, sir, and anarchists, and vegetarians, vegetarians!" But which sort of shows you the priorities of the peril facing England for foreigners, anarchists, and vegetarians. The vegetarians are the worst. And yes, it is an urban myth that Churchill's top hat took a round through it. That never happened. Another urban myth is that this intrepid anarchist historian, Philip Ruff, spent his time marching into KGB archives and interrogating the staff there and demanding classified documents. This actually, the fact that has become so widely circulated shows you how history gets distorted, because in 2008 I gave an interview with Ian Bowen, who some of you may know of, which made it onto YouTube, in which I referred to using original Russian police files of the period as part of the research. And I also had interviewed the KGB. That's two separate things. The myth puts them together and says that the archives I examined were the KGB archives, which is an impossibility to anybody who knew what life was like in the Soviet Union then. The archives I was referring to was actually the Tsarist secret police archives, the Okranka, which predated the KGB archives. But to just explain the fact that I interviewed the KGB instead of them interviewing me, which would normally be the procedure. I first went to Latvia in pursuit of this story in 1988, when Latvia was still an occupied country that was part of the Soviet Union then. I went as a tourist. I didn't speak Russian or Latvian, and all I had was addresses of a few people in Latvia, gleaned from Latvians who lived in London, who might be able to point me in the right direction. And one of those people was a professor, a historian, Valentin Steinberg, who's now dead, who managed to invite me back the following year under the auspices of the so-called Culture Committee, which to give it's to do a month's research. So to give it its proper title, it's the Committee for Cultural Relations with Countrymen Abroad, and that basically is the KGB. Just like the British Council would be the front office for MI6 when it comes to cultural exchanges across borders. So I naively arrived in Riga after a few adventures and appeared at the headquarters of this culture committee to be received, and I thought they'd tell me what the programme was. So we sat in the office, all smiles, oh, welcome to Soviet Latvia, and what is your programme? So I looked a bit baffled and looked back and said, well, I thought you'd have a programme for me. Okay, you've got no programme. Well, I want to go to Riga Central Prison, I want to go to the KGB, I want to go to... And halfway through me saying what the third thing on the list was, all the blood drained out of this guy's face. He turned completely ashen white and he leaned forward and whispered, you want to go to the KGB? I said, oh, yes please. Why not? One of the main characters in the book is somebody called Jakab Peters, who was in London during these events and was put on trial at the Old Bailey as being supposedly the person that killed the three policemen at Houndsditch. And he became number 2 in the Cheka, your organisation. I thought you might give me some insight on Peters. So, okay, we arranged. So I had a very surreal day when I visited the KGB, the so-called corner house or Sturmeier, in the morning, and saw Riga Central Prison in the afternoon, which was actually more like what usually happened. First you saw the KGB and then you went to Riga Central Prison. I didn't realise at the time, while I was interviewing 2 nice men in grey suits from the KGB, that beneath our feet was a prison in which people were held, and in which, until I think 1957, plenty of people were shot with a 9mm round to the back of the neck. I only subsequently realised that after Latvia regained its independence in 1991, and the Sturmeier was opened as a tourist attraction and as a warning. So that takes care of one urban myth. But the main myths are around Peter the Painter, of course. And basically everything anybody's ever said about Peter the Painter, what you may know about Peter the Painter, is wrong. All the contemporary police reports about Peter the Painter are wrong. He was supposedly, the legend arose, the myth arose, all because he appeared on a wanted poster issued in January 1911, on which was offered a reward for £500 because police wanted to talk to him in connection with the shooting at Houndsditch, in which 5 policemen were shot, 3 of them died and 2 were crippled for life, which is still today the worst case of violence committed against the police. However, he wasn't present at Houndsditch when the shootings took place. He had played no part in the shooting of the policeman. He wasn't at Sydney Street during the siege, from which he, according to the legend, he somehow miraculously escaped, even though there was a cordon of 750 armed men around the building. And he wasn't actually wanted for anything. This is simply because the authorities made a big fuss around the wanted for £500 Peter the Painter. When they investigated the case, they discovered actually there's no evidence to charge him with anything at all. So, however, they didn't tell the public. They didn't put an unwanted poster up saying, "Sorry, he's not wanted." And more importantly, as far as Peter the Painter was concerned, they didn't tell him So he went through the rest of his life thinking he was the most notorious wanted anarchist anywhere in the world, and if he was apprehended, he would be deported to London and hung for murdering 3 policemen. So you might think, oh well, that's it's a bit of an anticlimax, and he's not a very interesting figure, is he? Well, not in terms of what happened in London, maybe, but certainly in terms of what happened in Latvia. He was an absolutely major figure. And he certainly did kill people. He did kill policemen and German barons and army officers, and I've got time probably at all. But before I move to Latvia, I'll tell you who Peter the Painter actually was. He was a gentleman called Dienas Gramata. And Dienas Gramata was, in terms of those days, a relatively good education. He was the son of a provincial farmer just outside the Latvian town of Saldus in the west of Latvia. And as the youngest son of a family of 5 or 6, he was pampered, and the money was spent on giving the baby son a good education. So he went to secondary school, did his equivalent of A-levels, and was educated finally at the prestigious Koldiga Gymnasium, which was usually reserved for the relatives of the German barons, because the landowners in those days were German, although it was ruled as part of the Russian Empire. And during his education, as many students tend to be, he got interested in what was then the new ideas of socialism and revolution and class war, and became one of the founders of the first socialist organisation in the district where he lived. And by 1903, he had become very active, agitating in the countryside, and was wanted originally for printing and distributing leaflets, stirring up the farm workers and trying to get them to go on strike and so on. And he had to leg it from Latvia to Belarus, where his uncle, who was a colonel in the Russian army, lived, and did the same thing there. Unfortunately, he was arrested, and so the photographs of David Beckham's great-great-grandfather that you saw in the last film were in fact the mugshots taken in Minsk in 1904, which was the only occasion Peter the Painter was arrested. But he managed to wriggle out of those 2 cases and was released 3 days before the biggest event in Latvia's social history happened, which was the outbreak of the 1905 revolution on the 13th of January 1905, when a peaceful demonstration in the old town of Riga was attacked by armed soldiers, Russian soldiers, and at least 73 people were shot dead, and 200 plus were wounded trying to get away. And this acted as a trigger in Latvia for the biggest social revolution in the Russian Empire probably ever, prior to the 1917 revolution. Because in the rest of the Russian Empire and in Russia itself, 1905 was quite a minor revolution, consisting of strikes and a few barricades in Moscow. But in the Baltic provinces of Russia, what's today Latvia and Estonia, it was a very widespread, bitterly fought social revolutions, which became actually a national revolution, because virtually all of the Latvian population of the Baltic provinces sided with the revolution. So it became sort of catapulted from a sort of struggle for better pay and conditions suddenly overnight to an attempt to have a social revolution and also leave the Russian Empire, which you can imagine went down like a lead balloon with a Tsar. And during this attempt at liberation, the Social Democratic Workers' Party, which Jacques was then a member of, which is, if you like to imagine it as the Labour Party with guns, formed, because this was before Bolshevism, formed what it called a fighting organisation. First of all, there arose what they called the Federative Committee of Socialist Organisations, which was an umbrella group to try and unite the different socialist groups in Latvia. But effectively, it was the Latvian Social Democrats and the Jewish Bund. The few Bolsheviks that existed in those days chose not to get involved because they didn't believe in federalism, they were centralists. So they weren't part of the fun, really. And Dienas Gramata was given command at the age of 22 of the armed fighters, the militia, if you like, that fighting, what they called the fighting organisation of the Riga Federative Committee. That meant he was effectively the military commander of the Latvian Revolution. And during the year of 1905, until December 1905, he took part in all of the major, organised and took part in all of the major armed actions carried out by the Riga Federative Committee fighters, which included things like 52 fighters climbing over the wall of Riga Central Prison, shooting their way into the prison. Riga Central Prison was the most modern prison in the Russian Empire then. It was only opened in 1904. It even had central heating. So it was quite a modern facility. It's still a prison today. And they succeeded in getting inside the prison and freeing two socialist leaders who were facing the death penalty and escaping. And there was a series of similarly spectacular actions. At the end of 1905, Gramata, who then pretty much operated according to his own whim, really. He didn't really check out and go back to the Central Committee beforehand if he could do something. So if an action was needed, he tended to do it. And his party's Central Committee and the Federative Committee generally were pretty pissed off with him by this point. So they sacked him and put somebody else in the job. But he still took part as a result of him carrying out an unauthorised attack on a Russian dragoon garrison stationed in the Provodnik rubber factory in Riga. The Provodnik rubber factory was one of the biggest factories in Tsarist Russia, and he produced rubber for rubber tyres and everything made of rubber. So as a large organised centre for the Latvian proletariat with its own fighting group inside the factory, they used these dragoons to control the workers. And the dragoons had not only controlled the workers, but it generally made life unpleasant for everybody who lived around the Provodnik factory. They'd attack people in the street, they'd try to rape women on the street. And in the end, it got too much for everybody, and Gramata was asked to do something about it. And what he did was turn up for work for the morning shift with 17 other fighters, clock on as though they were just going to work, and then entered the barrack huts of the Russian dragoons and started shooting them. Most of them were still asleep. I think 16 or 17 Russian dragoons died in the attack. It was a famous attack, and as a result of which he was kicked out of the job as leader of the fighting organisation. So after he took part in a couple more sensational attacks, which are all in the book, so I won't try and go into detail about all of them. He ended up going to Helsinki with a group of these Latvian fighters after they'd just pulled off another sensational escape by attacking headquarters of the Riga secret police and freed 6 more socialists who were going to be killed and had already been tortured. And in Helsinki, they robbed the state bank of a fortune, part of which they gave to Lenin, and the bulk of which they took to Germany and Holland to spend on guns. So in 1906, the beginning of 1906, Jacques left Latvia as a social democrat and returned in April as a full-blown anarchist communist, which was the description that the anarchists used, and it just meant they adhere to the principles outlined in the books written by Peter Kropotkin on what Kropotkin called anarchist communism or scientific communism. Jacques really started, he started his own anarchist group called Pats, Vards and Davs, the same in word and deed. And the fact that he had such a big reputation as a fighter encouraged other people who had grown frustrated with the timidity of the armed Latvian Labour Party to leave the anarchists, to leave the socialists and join the anarchists. So you've got a big process of, very interesting process, but I won't go into it in detail now, of basically a whole stream of anarchist groups suddenly appearing almost out of nowhere. But the repression against the revolution at the end of 1905 was so severe that it forced most of these people, the people who weren't killed or shipped to Siberia, mostly were forced out of Latvia, which is how these guys came to end up in Western Europe and America. So what they were doing outside Latvia was basically continuing to try and run an armed resistance movement against this state repression, against the state terrorism. The terrorist then was the Tsar. It wasn't Peter the Painter. They were fighting against state terrorism of these 19,000 Russian soldiers that were sent into Latvia as a so-called punitive expedition to crush the revolution by killing people more or less at random. And in order to do that, they needed money. So I suppose really the myth that I'm challenging is not really the myth of Peter the Painter, it's the myth of what the Latvian anarchists outside Latvia were up to. And you see it very clearly in England. If you look, I think, in Encyclopedia Britannica, that the anarchists only probably appeared twice, and that's with the Siege of Sydney Street and the Anger Brigade. And that is because they're both seen as incidents of violent armed anarchism, armed struggle, terrorism. Actually, in both cases, that's bollocks. But in the case of the Latvians, I can prove it. Because what they're principally known for is the so-called Houndsditch murders, the attack on 5 unarmed policemen. And because the policemen they were used to dealing with were fully armed, and if they captured you, they tortured you as a prelude to shooting you while supposedly escaping. And if they didn't shoot you while you were escaping, they sent you to Riga prison, and then you were hung or shot, or both. And then jumped on. Following the Houndsditch murders, of course, there was the spectacular siege of Sydney Street. But of course, this wasn't armed terrorism, and it wasn't armed struggle, and they weren't trying to overthrow the British ruling class or the British establishment. This was simply crime. And a severe case of resisting arrest. What they were doing here was a mixture of armed robberies spread over a period going back at least to 1908. And then on the odd incident, which most of them were quite successful and we never heard about, and on the few occasions where they went wrong and they pulled their guns out to resist arrest. There was a bank robbery in Motherwell in Scotland in 1908. in which 2 Latvians are arrested and sent to prison after a rather botched armed stick-up of a bank. There was an armed wages snatch in Tottenham in January 1909, in which 2 Latvians committed suicide after firing something in excess of 500 rounds at the police that were chasing them over Hackney Marshes. There was the attempted Houndsditch robbery, which we knew about, and there was the siege of Sydney Street, which again was not terrorism, it was resisting arrest. So it's plain and simple. And if he couldn't resist arrest, he'd die in the attempt, which is what happened. But what they were doing through all these activities here and in other countries were raising funds to finance the armed resistance against Russian state terrorism in the Baltic. I'll just take a moment to correct my running order. Yes. So, the most interesting thing for me is that resistance, because that's what everything came from. All the mythical stories about Peter the Painter and all the sensational events in England, it all was centred on the Baltic. And so, although my book's selling point is Peter the Painter and what happened in London, really, that's a footnote to what the bulk of the book is about, which is what happened in Latvia. And although the obvious thing about Peter the Painter in London is interesting, and I do debunk it and explain it, the story is a much bigger story. I pull the camera out and show you the panoramic view of what was happening. And basically, by the end of 1905, the Socialists who had conducted armed resistance against, in a defensive way, against the Russian police, needed to be armed to protect their meetings and to protect strikes and to help free comrades who were arrested and to raise funds through what they call expropriations, robbery, and by attacking Russian soldiers. The Latvian party was saying, this isn't really going anywhere. We're just getting oppressed now and put in jail and shot and hung. We think we should follow the Russian example. And although we've got 13,000 members of the Latvian party, we think we should affiliate to the Russian Social Democratic Party, which then had only 6,000 members in the whole of the Russian Empire, which seems a bit illogical. And we'll change our policy from armed struggle against the Russian state to sending MPs to the Russian Duma, because one of the concessions of the 1905 revolution was the Tsar agreeing to convene a parliament instead of just saying what happened himself. And so the people who wanted to go on with the revolutionary struggle, wanted to go on resisting the Tsar, and wanted to go on trying to free Latvia, basically followed the lead of Anarchists, who said, well, the only people who want to fight now are the anarchists, so let's become anarchists. And that is indeed what happened. It wasn't a case of suddenly the people listened to anarchist agitators and said, oh, that's a good idea, let's be an anarchist, which is the approach anarchists have today. The struggle created the Latvian anarchist movement, not anarchists. Their real experiences in struggling against the Russian Empire forced them to be radical. It forced them to defend themselves with guns. And it forced them into a position where they understood that going into the Russian parliament and trying to vote in socialism into Tsarist Russia was not going to work. Our best chance of breaking out of the Russian Empire is to resist Russian imperialism and Russian state terrorism. So this created this quite extensive Latvian anarchist movement, which was being funded from abroad and printing its papers from abroad, from London and New York and Paris. Which to me is tremendously interesting. When you go into it in more detail, it's a tremendously interesting development, because it wasn't anything, none of this was done in the abstract. And of course, me being an anarchist in the 1970s, I could see parallels and with obvious differences between what they were doing in the Baltic after the 1905 revolution and what the sort of 60s generation that spilled over from the hippies of the counterculture in the 60s into, you know, groups like the Anger Brigade and the Red Army Faction, 2nd of June movement, and all these urban guerrilla groups, allegedly, that sprouted up in Western Europe and indeed in America with the Weathermen. There was a curious resonance, but there was an obvious difference. And the difference was the armed struggle in Latvia grew out of people's real experience, and it had the support of the population. I mean, the whole population. It wasn't like, oh, you know, I'm a socialist, but I don't really think you should have shot that Russian soldier. You know, it was a brutal situation where there were, actually, in the countryside, there were actually battles on a military scale between crudely armed Latvian peasants who, you know, with a few Mausers, and regular army detachments of Russian Cossacks and Dragoons. And more often than not, the Russian Cossacks and Dragoons lost. And the peasants actually seized the landed estates, burnt down the fortified manor houses and castles, and tried to socialise and redistribute the land. And of course that was stopped by the punitive expedition of 19,000 troops. So, and in a way there's more in common between Latvian history and Irish history, in the same way that the IRA has always had this physical force branch of Irish nationalism, which at various times in their histories have thought, well, the only way to resist British imperialism is with the gun, or later in the 70s they adopted the Armalite and the ballot box. But the thing that Ireland has always had in common with Latvia is it's always had a significant amount of support of the population. And no guerrilla struggle or urban armed struggle can exist without that. And ultimately, because of the separation in the 60s and the 70s, it actually started after the First World War, between the working class and the left, which by the time that these armed groups appeared in Europe really was total. You had the left and you had the working class. There was a bit of overlap. People like the Socialist Workers' Party that tried to recruit token workers to sell paper. Socialist worker. That's revolutionary struggle, by the way. That's fighting the revolution, selling a newspaper on a street corner. And so the people who were frustrated with that slipped into quite, without thinking about it too seriously in some cases, slipped into what was called by the press the Anger Brigade, which was a misnomer. It was a joke, that term, really. It didn't really describe anything. Or some bombs were claimed by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or the Wild Bunch. But the term that caught the eye of the press was the Anger Brigade, so that's what that experiment became known as. And it happened in Germany, where a generation of young Germans got very angry about their parents' generation doing nothing to resist Hitler, and there being no anti-fascist resistance against Hitler, because the KPD, the German Communist Party, followed Stalin's orders and respected the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which divided Eastern Europe up between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. So if you're interested in exploring it, I'm welcome to go into it further when we just go into a discussion, but I'm just flagging it up as one interesting aspect of this story. That yes, it's a historical work. Yes, it explains a few old murder mysteries. Yes, it's a social history of a chunk of Latvian history that was successfully airbrushed from the Latvian population under the Soviet occupation that followed the end of the Second World War. But it is actually very contemporary in resonance when you read it, certainly to somebody in my generation, because there are so many parallels. The ideas of anarchism in 1905, 1906 were totally new to that generation of socialists. So it was a new idea. The idea of socialism and indeed Marxism were relatively new. So class struggle politics was a new thing, a new vista that offered something new and exciting, a counterculture, if you like, a better alternative to what existed. Because nobody imagined that half the characters in my book would go on to be the founding fathers of the Soviet Union and the KGB, and completely discredit any idea of socialism forever again. So that if you mention socialism now, they say, oh, it's the Soviet Union, we don't want that. But no, these people were all young, idealistic, artistic people who were eager for new ideas, new ways of living. They were interested in what we would call alternative culture, counterculture, interested in feminism and in challenging the nuclear family and in all of the things we associate with the counterculture of the 1960s. But they did it then, in 1905. Well, I think I'll leave it there and throw it open to anybody that wants to ask questions or explore any of what I've said.
Was that about? Before we go into questions, I hope people got a quick think about things they want to ask, because I think that's a very wide-ranging talk. Plenty of queries out. I just want to say something about Breviary Stuff, the publishers of Phil's book. 10 years ago, Bristol Radical History Group had just done a reenactment of a pirate hanging in Bridport, which is the kind of thing we used to do a lot in those days. And so we went to the pub after we'd done this event, and that's where I met Paul, hanging over there, who's with his partner, the main movers in Breviary Stuff Publications. And Paul was in the pub and he was complaining about the fact that there were so many history books that had gone out of print, really important social histories, and certainly a rural and an urban class struggle. And we were basically saying, is it a shame, that not only they're out of print, but also there seemed to be this new kind of style amongst academics for going for these publishers where the books are like 70 quid when they're new. And I'm sure you've come across that over the last few years. There's a lot of good books that I looked at one today and it was 120 quid new. And there's been plenty of books about Bristol quite recently. I shouldn't mention the name of the authors, but I won't name the author, but I'll name the books. For example, Bristol from Below, a brilliant book about socialist in Bristol in the 19th century, 70 quid. Slavery Obscured, the social history of slavery in Bristol, absolutely vital book to understand the city and slavery, 70 quid. So Paul said at the time, this has got to change, we've got to do something about this. We need to reproduce these books so that people actually buy them and read them. And we were very encouraging. We were like, yeah, do it. Now Paul, I know Paul from a long time ago before I met him in that pub. And we both come out of the culture of the 1980s, which was out of the punk scene. And one part of that culture, which has been expressed in the city and many other places, was do it yourself. Don't wait around for anyone to give you any money. Put your labour in for free and make it fucking happen. And that is what Paul did over the next year. Now 25 titles out there. And I urge you to look at the Breviary Stuff website to see the job he's done. Not only is it a brilliant job in terms of DIY, because it's certainly quality stuff, but also he's rescued stuff that you wouldn't have imagined. I mean, E.P. Thompson, he signed agreements with people like E.P. Thompson, got this stuff out that was going out of print or people couldn't get access to, on the basis that people should be able to read social history of class struggle in this country without having to have some kind of serious, well-paid job. So I just wanted to big him up because he's done a great job. When I saw that Phil had gone with Breviary Stuff, I thought, what a good choice that is, because we need to support these small publishers, and they will have a big impact, and they have had it, or are having a big impact now, because publishing is not something that's rocket science. People can actually do it, as we've proved in Bristol Radical History Group as well. So I'll shut up now anyway. Questions? Barbara.
You contrasted the socialists with the anarchists in terms of the willingness of anarchists to take up armed struggle, not only defensively but also to further their aims. But you haven't said very much about the way they organised, and you did touch on the very end on stuff like counterculture and so on, and made the parallel with the 60s. I wonder, could you tell us something about how the anarchists at that time organised their structures at a sort of grassroots level, and how that differed from the way the socialists organised?
Well, in a sense, it wasn't all that different. The main difference between them was what they wanted to do. For instance, because you must bear in mind that the Baltic provinces then were a police state until October 1905. All socialists' propaganda and agitation and publication was illegal. So Jacques was prosecuted for producing leaflets. So they organised the Latvian Social Democratic Workers' Party, which is the main socialist but not the only socialist group in Latvia, organised on a cell structure which consisted of around 10 people. So that would be for security reasons. And to some extent, it wasn't that secure, because in practice, both the socialists and the anarchists tended to know each other outside of their particular cell, because it was also based on friendship networks. So when people started leaving the Socialist Party and forming anarchist groups and just calling themselves anarchists, they were basically doing what they'd done as socialists, but they were calling themselves anarchists and not socialists, or social democrats was the term at that time. So anarchist groups also tended to be about 10 people. In Spain, the anarchists would call that an affinity group. And certainly for my generation of anarchists, I always understood the basic foundation of anarchist organisation to be the affinity group. And this makes sense because you're working with basically your friends, people you trust, people you're on the same wavelength with in terms of ideas. And it's just more effective way of operating, and certainly some defence, not a total defence, but some defence against police infiltration. And of course, within the fact that you are a friendship-based group, you're not just carrying out burglaries at jewellery shops and trying to stick up banks. You're also publishing stuff. You've got a social interaction between the group members. You're experimenting. Certainly, I was attempting to in the 70s with what they called then free love, which is now probably just called promiscuous sex. So you would, when I was young, we were like taking drugs and getting drunk and trying to have sex with as many people as possible, and seeing this as political, under the slogan "the person is political," challenging the ideas you had to women. Sometimes it got to ridiculous lengths, like, we've got to arrange the chairs in a circle, because if we have somebody at the front and you lot in the audience, that's reinforcing patriarchy and hierarchy.
Well, I was one of those. I don't think it's ridiculous, but anyway.
Well,
I think
there's arguments to be made on both sides of the divide.
Yeah.
So,
but I'm wondering about hierarchies.
I'm certainly not rubbishing an attempt to challenge the attitudes. And to some extent, that was being done before the First World War by the Latvians. I don't know how much degree they really were consciously trying to change their attitudes to women, the men anarchists, I mean, or whether they were just taking advantage of the fact that the women would agree to sex more easily because they thought it was a political act. I think that happened a bit in the 1960s as well, I think. But certainly from what I can gather by looking into these people's lives, they weren't just like grim-faced desperados. They were young idealists who were interested in new ideas and new ways of relating. What made it difficult in Latvia was that they were living in a police state. So when they got to Europe, on one level it was much easier for them because they could print their newspapers in London and New York and Paris legally. But also it was harder for them in a sense because it was hard for them to come to terms with the fact that in what you can call, a democracy, in contrast to Tsarist autocracy and a total police state, I think there was less of an argument you could make for armed activities in, say, London. And there was a concrete example of this because in 1909, two of the Latvian anarchists principally involved in this story, Fritz Vars, who died in Sydney Street, and his friend Hartmanis, who was accidentally killed as a result of the Anarchist shootings, went to another Latvian in London who was involved in a strike at some factory in the East End, and offered their, according to his unpublished memoirs, which I've read in the Latvian archives, they offered their armed assistance, the assistance of their Mausers, in support of the strike. That meant, do you want us to shoot the foreman and the factory boss? And because that's what they would have done in Latvia. If there was a strike, they would have shot the boss of the factory and the brutal foreman and anybody that was trying to break the strike, like the Blacklegs. Those are the targets for their Mausers. And this guy who was, they were anarchists by that point, but they knew this guy from when they were all in the Socialist Party, had to sort of patiently pacify them and say, look, comrades, it's not really how things are done in London. We don't go around shooting the boss of the factory and the foreman. But the knee-jerk response was, oh, strike? Well, we've got guns. We can help you. We can shoot somebody. And so, that was the difference in, and the fact that they shot first and asked questions when they were challenged at Houndsditch illustrates that. It was easier for them in one way, and it was harder for them in another because they didn't understand that, life in a bourgeois democracy was, in a bourgeois democracy, socialists tended not to use weapons when in their struggles. So,
I was thinking more in terms of hierarchies and leadership and how, whether those small cells were autonomous or whether they networked with each other.
They were.
I think it's for me as an anarchist, I think it's important to get away from the link between anarchism and political violence, yes, which I would support in a lot of instances, but to me anarchism is much more about sort of the society, the structure of the society and of your group and so on.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. And there were quite a lot of anarchist groups. There were several in London at the time, Latvian anarchist groups, and they were all autonomous. They were all sort of, about 10 people, 12 people. But at the same, and they were in touch with groups in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Manchester, Paris, Berlin, and there was various attempts, which you can see when you go through the literature, to coordinate the activities more. Mm-hmm. They weren't organised as one closed group, they were independent groups, but there were various attempts, both in Latvia and outside, to organise a sort of coordinating federation. But again, what tended to get in the way was police action. And certainly all the activities in London were absolutely ruined by the fallout from the Houndsditch shootings and the siege of Sidney Street, because what Peter the Painter wanted to do in London was to create a safe base from which the resistance could send people back into Latvia in small groups to carry out actions and smuggle literature in. He intended to set up a library to collect information on the 1905 revolution, so that experience was documented and wasn't lost. And an anarchist library of publications, and they got a special committee for raising money, albeit through robberies, which would then be distributed to other groups to fund their activities, and to send money to the families of people in prison in Latvia, and to try and help people escape from Siberia. So he had all these big plans for the future that were totally wrecked by the fact that while he was at home playing the violin, which is what he was doing during the Houndsditch robbery, some of his friends were busy killing policemen in the city of London. And the fact that they had done that and brought one of their comrades who was wounded accidentally back to his flat and left him there meant that Peter the Painter and everybody else had to leg it sharpish. And so they had to leave everything behind, most of their possessions, and just run out into the night and try and get away. And Peter the Painter managed to. He left London before the siege of Sidney Street. He left on the 22nd of December. Shootings on the 16th, he left on the 22nd of December. And the siege was on the 3rd of January. So he wasn't even in England during the siege of Sidney Street. But, you know, his plans for the future were totally wrecked by that.
Thanks.
Mike?
Yeah, and did these anarchists have any connection with other anarchist groups in London, like the Jubilee Street Club and Rudolf Rocker?
Yeah, they had certainly had some connections. They certainly had a connection with the Enrico Malatesta because they rented metal cutting equipment from Malatesta, who had a workshop in Islington. And Malatesta was actually interviewed by the police subsequently, had to give a statement. Historically, they not only the Latvian anarchists but Latvian socialists had quite strong personal connections with Peter Kropotkin because they'd met Kropotkin in London in the turn of the century, turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. They had some connections, some with socialist organisations. Certainly, well, Jakov Peters, who wasn't an anarchist, he was the cousin of Fritz Vars, who was an anarchist, which is the only reason he was brought into the case. He was a member of the British Socialist Party as well as the Latvian Social Democracy. Quite a few of them were members of British trade unions. You'll see in the book a lot of material about gun running from Britain to the Baltic. And in that gun running, there were quite a lot of English socialists involved because of what they were doing with the money stolen in the Baltic was buying guns quite legally, in some cases straight from the factories in Western Europe, stockpiling them around Britain and Scotland, making them up into shipments and smuggling them back into the Baltic. And there was a couple of cases in Newcastle and Sunderland in, I think, 1907, where British socialists were amongst those prosecuted for warehousing and having in their houses very large amounts of ammunition, arms and principally ammunition. I mean, hundreds of thousands of rounds, big shipments. Again, that's it. I go into that in the book in great detail.
Steve? This Steve's at the front.
Okay. My question was around the Baltic countercultures of the 70s and 80s, and whether the people that were involved with that were kind of aware of this older tradition of the counterculture, or whether, because I mean,
Not really.
going over to Estonia, what I managed to sort of glean from the museums is that counterculture was quite Christian and quite conservative in many ways, and there was the singing revolution, but then there was also a kind of hybrid, more of a counterculture. So whether they were kind of looking back to the West, or whether there was a kind of a folk memory of the earlier counterculture, or whether that was kind of totally obliterated by the intervening years.
I think it was obliterated, certainly in Eastern Europe, and certainly even the knowledge that there were anarchists in Latvia and Estonia before it became forcibly part of the Soviet Union was quite consciously filleted out of history by the Soviet historians. When I went through Soviet-produced histories of the whole period that I looked at, Dienas Gramata appears about 4 times, and 3 of those times are in footnotes, and is quite a minor, presented as quite a minor figure. And other people have whole chapters in the same publications about what they were doing. And in most cases, they're much more minor figures than Gramata was. You know, they took part in actions that he organised, but he doesn't have a chapter about it because he left the party in 1906, and at that point, he was of no interest to Soviet historians. I remember still in the Soviet time, going to the archive of the Latvian Communist Party and trying to get material on Fritz Vars. And the Soviet historian I talked to, when I said, "Oh, have you got any information on Fritz Vars?" She said, we're not interested in people like him, we're only interested in the revolutionaries. You know, she meant people who were either Bolsheviks or who subsequently could be claimed as Bolsheviks. She said, Svars was expelled from the party, we're not interested in you, we're only interested in the revolutionaries. She meant people who the Soviet Union could brag about.
That really underscores the importance of the hidden history that you've
But in terms of the counterculture, in the 60s and 70s, of course, what you could call counterculture had to struggle against the police state, which is run by the KGB. And if you were too countercultural, it was very easy to wind up in Riga Central Prison or find yourself in a gulag camp. You know, I remember in the days of Glasnost talking to somebody and said, we just published a Latvian edition of Animal Farm. This was still in the Gorbachev days, 1989. I had a friend who 2 years ago was sent to the gulag for having that same book. Now it's been legally published. So, you know, the counterculture then was totally legal. You know, if you were listening to pirate copies of Beatles records that were copied onto X-ray negatives, what they call flexi discs, or you know, discussing French literature, or you could be sent to a camp for that. So they had Eastern Europe had no connection really with the counterculture of the West. They only found out about that in 1991. My wife, who's sitting at the front, who's Latvian, only heard about the Beatles, you know, in the when was it?
I was 17.
Yeah, when was that?
71.
Yeah. She only heard that there was such a group as the Beatles in 71. I don't know when it was that she actually heard the Beatles. She was denounced as a Beatle maniac in the 60s when her father was a journalist. Was one of the first Soviet journalists to go to America and wrote a book about his impressions of America when he returned. When he came back, he bought his twin daughters red nylon socks, which you couldn't get in the Soviet Union. So red nylon socks, great. And when my wife and her sister went out in the street, people started to denounce them. Oh, Beatle maniac! Some mad bohemian because you're wearing red nylon socks.
Sheila.
It's really interesting these links, and how, because often historians go and look at organisations, so they keep it boxed into the categories of, you know, where the boundaries are. So where you're looking goes over, and it reminded me of Ken Weller's book about Islington, looking at the crossovers between different groups and people calling themselves different things. But I wondered when
about when you said about feminism, because I thought, I mean, I don't know anything about Latvian anarchists, but usually anarchists were very suspicious of feminism, and indeed so were the Bolsheviks, because they said it was bourgeois. And so the women, certainly women Bolsheviks, like Kollontai, who wanted to argue for both the sexual emancipation of women and other aspects of women's emancipation at work, were very emphatic about opposing bourgeois feminism, because that was the space that they could get within the Bolsheviks to argue, for emancipation of working class women. And I wondered whether there's any evidence about how the anarchist women in the Latvian situation, how did they define their emancipation? Because women have not always said, obviously, that they were feminists. They wanted to be emancipated, but in different ways.
Well, I think in Latvia, not just the anarchists, but probably the social democrats as well. You often hear about people like Peter the Painter and the men, but actually, when you look at the 1905 revolution and the anarchist movement and the armed struggle, you find actually, to your surprise, that there were quite a lot of women involved on an equal basis. They weren't just making the tea while the men talked the politics. They were taking part in the attack on the Riga Central Police. Women were involved in the attack. There was a very similar siege to the siege of Sydney Street in Stabuila in Riga, which is quite near to the KGB building, in 1906, when two anarchists from Peter the Painter's group, Patsvards and Darts, were cornered in exactly the same way as the siege of Sydney Street, where they were besieged by Russian soldiers for most of the day. One was a man and the other was a woman, Anna Sauna, and both of them died in the siege. I think there's a photograph of Anna Sauna in the book, these weren't exceptions. They wanted to be taken seriously on the same level as the men, and they made sure that the men did take them seriously, and they did play a very important role in the whole struggle, which too many ways to detail. How much they called it feminism, I'm not sure, but certainly the two big literary figures of the day, and still probably today, are the poet and playwright Jānis Rainis and his companion, who used the pen name Aspasia, who was a conscious feminist and a poet in her own right, and probably in some ways a better playwright than her more famous husband. They were both Marxists. They were both members of the Latvian Social Workers Party. They both had to leave Latvia as a result of the failure of the 1905 revolution and moved to Switzerland, and then returned to Latvia after 1917, and after a three-cornered national liberation war, Latvia eventually proclaimed a Latvian Republic in 1918 and actually came into being in 1920. And Rainis was a Social Democrat member of Parliament. And certainly Aspasia then and now was a huge figure in terms of a role model and a figurehead for feminism as well as poetry. She's certainly the most famous one. It's hard to gauge really the degree of how, that it existed, because there's very little written down. The fact that this book has taken 30 years to get out is because there was nothing published on it. And I've tried to piece the story together from going through police files in the former Tsarist police files, English police files, and trying to weave a jigsaw of it to try and draw out a pattern. I knew absolutely nothing about Jānis Jāklis when I first went to Latvia. I even thought that Peter the Painter was somebody else who appears in the book, Jedets Elias, who was a famous painter. And subsequently had to rip up the whole of the book and start again when I found out that no, here's proof that Peter the Painter was Jānis Jāklis. Then I had to think, well, where do I get information about Jānis Jāklis? All the Soviet accounts, they just got 4 footnotes. So then I had to wait till the Soviet Union collapsed so I could get in the archives and sit for hours and hours with Irene, my wife, next to me, translating verbally from Old Russian, not modern Russian, Old Russian and Old Latvian, because both languages were modernised after 1917. And me furiously writing down in English the gist of that, and then requesting photocopies of those documents so I could get Irene to translate them all in full when we got home. So I must pay tribute to my wife here, because in the name of feminism and justice, because this book wouldn't have been published and it wouldn't have been finished if it wasn't for Irene, simply by the nature of the work involved, in that I could not have translated all those documents from all these police files in order to try and evaluate them and fit them into a pattern. Because obviously I wasn't doing this solidly for 30 years. Probably 10 of that 30 years was actively working on that book. But I'd sort of lost interest in it really until Irene came to London to join me in 2000. In 3. Time flies when you're having fun. And she really gave me the kick up the arse to get back into finishing it. And the fact that she could speak Russian and Latvian, of course, it meant that we could actually go into the archives and go through them. Open documents that had been written by some Tsarist secret policeman and probably had been seen by about 5 people since he wrote it.
Steve, at the back.
Yeah, could you say something about the activity of the Latvian anarchists in the build-up to 1917, and also in relationship to a very small period, as far as I can understand it, a good relationship between the Bolsheviks and the anarchists in Moscow, only for about 6 months, and then there was a big clampdown by the Bolsheviks on the anarchists. Did that affect the anarchist comrades in Latvia? And were they still very active in the build-up to the revolution?
Yeah, there's two parts of that answer.
Yes.
Both of which I go into in some detail in the book, but in a brief way, there was a crossover between Latvia and Russia in both directions. But what happened when the 1917 revolution happened was, first of all, the Russian army collapsed, and all the Russians rushed home to try and get some of the land that was being redistributed as a result of the abdication of the Tsar. Latvia at that point was still a battlefield. It was still occupied by the German army. The First World War was still going on. And a large part of the Latvian population had been forced out of Latvia to get away from the Germans and went as refugees to St. Petersburg and other parts of Russia. So there was a huge Latvian presence in what became the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. At the same time, the only reliable elements of the Tsarist army were the Latvian rifle regiments, which gradually were pushed by the Germans out of Latvia into Russia. And these were the troops that Lenin used to prop up his regime, because they were the only armed units that would follow orders. They had a history of the 1905 revolution behind them, so quite a lot of the soldiers had a real memory of the 1905 revolution, and probably their older brother and certainly their parents had been part of that. And so quite a lot of them were socialists, and they supported the Bolsheviks to some degree ideologically, but certainly they agreed, as they couldn't defend their families in Latvia because it was occupied by the German army, that while they were in Russia, they would support Lenin, and essentially they were the basis for the Red Army. So they were rebranded as units of the Red Army. But the agreement said, we'll stay in the Red Army until such time as we can go back to Latvia, which is to some degree what happened. So you'll see in the book that basically the Latvian riflemen take part in every serious incident in the Russian Civil War, and ironically they were used to suppress not only the Russian anarchists but the Latvian anarchists in Moscow, because there was quite a significant Latvian anarchist presence in Moscow. And the action to suppress the Latvian and Russian anarchists in Russia was organised and led by the Latvian Czechist Jēkabs Peters, who had stood trial at the Old Bailey for the Houndsditch murders. The other part of the the attitudes of the Russian anarchists and the Latvian anarchists to the Bolshevik Revolution are explained in the book. Basically, some were for it and some were against it, and as the repression bit in, they all ended up all being against it if they weren't sent to the Gulag or killed. In Latvia, Latvia got its independence from the fact that Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans and ceded parts of the Russian Empire to the Germans, like the Baltic states, Ukraine, and so on. So there was quite a bitter three-sided war of independence, I think you can call it, between 1917, 1918 and 1920, which what became the first Latvian Republic won, so the Latvian nationalists. In the spring of 1919, there were three governments in Latvia simultaneously. There was a Latvian nationalist government, there was a German puppet government, and there was a Bolshevik government, a Soviet government fronted by Latvian Bolsheviks under the President Petrs Stučka, who was a Latvian communist. So everybody was fighting everybody else because the victorious allies in the First World War allowed the German army to keep its weapons in order to ensure that Latvia didn't go red. They didn't want Latvia to go Bolshevik. So there's a very complicated history. The Latvian anarchists continued, I know, and were documented, I know, by the Russian secret police up to 1917. And they were more widespread than even I imagined. In 1917, all the documents stopped because the people that were writing the documents were suddenly out of a job. You know, the Russian secret police had to run for their lives because now the boot was on the other foot. You know, the Okranka were now the bad guys. They weren't the good guys because the bad guys were now in the government. So all the Tsarist police, if they were lucky, got jobs in the Cheka and continued being secret policemen. If they were unlucky, they went downstairs and got a bullet in the back of the head. So the records documenting what the anarchists stopped in 1917. But yes, it all continued and it all ended and there was some crossover.
Can I just one quickly? The story of the relationship between the Bolsheviks and the anarchists after the revolution often is focused on the repression of the Bolsheviks against the anarchists in the early years of the Civil War. Yeah. But I think it was a lot quicker than that, wasn't it? Particularly in Moscow. Within 6 months of the revolution, the repression of the anarchists were taking place.
Yeah, the anarchists were the first to be squashed. Then I think they did it. The Mensheviks and the left socialist revolutionaries, and then factions within the party and so on. But There's a very simple reason for that. It's because the anarchists were seen as the biggest threat to Lenin, not in terms of their numbers, but in terms of the fact that they had an alternative recipe for how to get to a classless society. Lenin said, well, we've got to go through a workers' dictatorship first and have a so-called workers' state, which is actually a state controlled by the Communist Party Central Committee, which is controlled by me. And the anarchists are saying we don't have to do that. We can just go straight to revolution and have workers' control of industry with the workers' control of it, not the party, and have real trade unions that are not controlled by the government. And as well as the Bolsheviks having armed Red Guards, what anarchists existed in Russia had their own armed Black Guards. So here we've got a socialist grouping who have an alternative to Lenin, alternative ideology, an alternative method of reaching socialism that is the opposite of Leninism. And they're armed. So we have to deal with them because they could overthrow us. It's important to recognise how weak Lenin's position was in 1917-18, and how important having the support of Latvian soldiers it was. Without the Latvian riflemen, Lenin wouldn't have lasted 6 months.
And as we saw a few months ago, the importance of them, the Bolsheviks needing the left SRs to come to power in the first place, then they would come to power.
You made the parallel and the comparison between, like a brief comparison between those anarchists of the beginning of the 20th century and the Red Army faction, for example, and more recent anarchist movements. And it sounds like a critic of the political violence of those recent groups. So can you go further in this parallel, this reflection?
Yeah, well, the point I was trying to make wasn't really...
Would you mind summarising the question for us? It was a bit too quiet to hear over here.
Do you want me to do it? Yeah.
Just so I know what the answer's talking about.
We're drawing out a comparison between the relationship between what was going on amongst these Latvian anarchists and the situation in Latvia in the early part of the century, and then the counterculture 60s leading to these so-called urban guerrilla groups, but the question around perhaps their connection to real struggles and the working class in general.
I mean, what the point I was trying to make by drawing a parallel and the differences between 1905 and 1968 onwards was that in both cases they grew out of concrete situations, but the situations were totally different. In Latvia, it was a mass resistance of state terrorism and state oppression conducted by the Russian Emperor, the Tsar. And it had, really popular mass support. The fact that it turned violent was forced upon the Latvian people because the Russians were violent first to them. So it was purely defensive. In Germany, in particular, Germany is probably the most interesting case in point. There was a totally different situation. The post-war generation of young Germans were opposed to the war in Vietnam. They were opposed to the oppression in the Third World. They had the idea that, particularly the Red Army faction had the ideological hook that we are fighting the battles of the Third World in the metropoles and the capital cities of the First World. And so they bombed, the RAF bombed a military base in Germany where they believed computers directed the B-52s bombing North Vietnam, for instance. But the other main historical peculiarity which led to the emergence of basically three separate armed groups, which are usually called the Baader-Meinhof group, but were in fact the Red Army fraction, not faction, but fraction, because they saw themselves as a fraction of a future Red Army, which the bulk of which would be made up by the working class. the 2nd of June movement, which was specifically anarchist, Ruff being Marxist-Leninist, and a third group, which is called the Revolutionary Cells, which developed sort of later. One of the big motivations for that generation of Germans was their parents, like my parents, had been in the war, but their parents had been fighting for Hitler, or at least had been conscripted into Hitler's army. And so there was a lot of anger in West Germany against their parents, which I guess teed in with teenage angst and youthful rebellion against your parents anyway. But in the Germans' case, they weren't just angry because their parents were square and didn't like their records. They were angry with their mum and dad because they'd been members of the Nazi Party, or they'd been in the SS, or they'd been on the gate at Auschwitz. And more importantly, there had been no armed resistance to Hitler, apart from a few isolated attempts to kill Hitler. In Germany, the German Communist Party was the biggest communist party anywhere outside Russia. It had its own Red Army. It could have toppled Hitler in a week if it wanted to, but it did absolutely nothing to stop Hitler, because Hitler and Stalin did a deal to carve up Eastern Europe. When the Second World War started, the Soviet Union, although they claimed they only came into the war in 1941, the Soviet Union took part in the Second World War in 1939 on Hitler's side. They carved up Poland between them. Hitler had half of Poland and Stalin had the other half. And they shook hands at the demarcation point. So the young Germans were really pissed off and enraged that their parents' generation had done nothing to stop the rise of fascism Nazism in Germany. And they saw, from their point of view, fascism starting again. All the leaders in industry, business and the armed forces were all old Nazis. When in 1977, the Red Army faction kidnapped Hans-Martin Schleyer, who was the chairman of the Employers' Federation in Germany. He wasn't chosen accidentally. Hans-Martin Schleyer was an important member of the SS during the war. So he was a symbolic, take him was a symbolic choice. So there was this determination that we aren't going to do what our parents did, which was nothing. We see a move to the right in Europe. Germany is supporting the Vietnam War, it's supporting the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran paid a very high-profile visit to Germany in 1967, in which all the left-wing protesters had the shit beaten out of them by the German police. And so they turned around, some of these people, and said, we're not going to be the target for police brutality, we're going to start shooting back. And that was the start of what became what the press like to call the Baader-Meinhof group. So we had a sort of different things behind it. But the crucial difference was, by and large, the left in Germany and pretty much the whole of Western Europe was completely separate from the working class, from the trade unions, from the workers' movement. There were some attempts to link up, but the most famous being the uprising in Paris in 1968. Well, what happened in Paris? Yeah, the workers occupied the factories. What did the students do? All these situationists and Trotskyists and anarchists. They sat in fucking so-called occupied university lecture halls debating situationism. Well, the revolution was going on outside in the occupied factories. That was the reality of it, and there was a bit of rioting in the streets. That was the so-called May Revolution. There was a complete separation between the working class and the left. And in the early years of the workers' movement and the development of the left, there wasn't that separation. It was the same thing. The working class movement in Latvia, and to a lesser extent in Russia, the left were workers. They weren't dilettante intellectuals and university lecturers and art teachers. They were factory workers. It's as simple as that. And
Before Sheila comes back here, this kid's been waiting a long time in the back here. Sorry, so do you want to go?
Yeah, you mentioned the Jewish fund, I think, earlier on in your talk. I was wondering what happened during the revolution with the Jewish fund, and then like later on, because obviously a lot of Jews have been kicked out of Latvia earlier on, about the turn of the century.
yeah, well, the Bund, of course, was an all-Russia organisation, which it existed outside Russia in Belarus and the Baltic provinces. In the Baltic provinces, it's quite interesting because in Russia proper, there's a terrible history of pogroms, anti-Jewish pogroms, and even amongst otherwise socialist thinking Russians, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism. Even Bakunin made some notorious statements in his writings about Jews, which today appear blatantly anti-Semitism. In fact, Karl Marx said equally nasty things about Jews. But in the Baltic provinces of Russia, again for historical reasons, anti-Semitism really didn't exist at that time. And there was discrimination against the Jews because they were under the Tsarist political system. They could only live in designated areas, the shtetl, and they could only move to Riga with special permission and so on. But amongst ordinary Latvians, there was no anti-Semitism. And at various points during the 1905 revolution, there were attempts by the police force and various important people against the revolution to start pogroms. You know, basically because the police went to Latvian ne'er-do-wells and layabouts and you know what we call yobs, and gave them pistols and said, well, go into the Riga, which is the Moscow district, and attack the Jewish asylum and the synagogues. And that was defeated by the Jewish fighters from the Bund and non-Jewish fighters from the Federative Committee, all under Peter the Painter's direction, going down to those areas and fighting with these so-called Black Hundreds and disarming them. So really until the German occupation of Latvia in 1941, it's very hard to find cases of anti-Semitism in the Baltic. And the Bund was very strong in Latvia. It was much bigger than the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks had a few hundred people. The Bund had a couple of thousand. The Latvian Social Democrats at its peak had about 13,000. So the Bund were really real partners with the Latvian Social Democrats in taking part jointly in the actions of 1905. What became of it, I'm not really sure as an organisation, because I haven't really studied the whole history of the Russian Bund.
Right, I've got 3 at the moment, and it's going to be Alan first.
I'll dispute Marx's anti-Semitism. He was Jewish.
Sorry, could you speak up?
I
Could
would
you use the
dispute.
mic?
I would dispute.
Good idea.
I would dispute Marx's anti-Semitism. One, obviously, was Jew. Second, when you read his essays on Judaism, what he's writing is about the religion, not it's not anti-Semitic.
Comment on that? We can have the next question. Sheila.
Oh, I think you rather caricatured the name people, because you rather caricatured the people in May '68. I mean, it was a slick story, but that wasn't the total truth. Because obviously the CP controlled the unions and a lot of the workers' demonstrations, and it was a strongly disciplined force. But the May people, the May students did make links with the immigrant younger workers who were outside that CP territory. And there were some very funny things, like the filmmakers were sent off to make films about workers. And then the transport broke down because the workers were on strike. And so they were stuck. They were completely stranded from everybody else, sitting, talking to a worker or a group of workers in some far-flung part of the Paris suburbs. And they never got back to anything that was going on with the demonstrations. And the people who started the Crèche Sauvage, it was in July after the May events when they tried to continue them and open them for workers' children as well as for the people who were demonstrating. That they were then stormed by the police, so there were kind of toddlers and parents, both working class and students, defending the Crèche Sauvage against the police. So there were lots of different routes going out in those months as well, and some young workers who were interested in what was going on.
Well, I may be guilty of presenting a caricature, but I was trying to illustrate a broad historical development in a short way.
It was a broad thing.
But I think it is correct that since 1919 there's been a widening gulf between the working class and the left. The point I was making.
Yeah, I was wondering a bit about why the Latvians ended up in London, and a bit about your take on how London was. So following the repression in 1905, you know, obviously in the 19th century, London was kind of like a safe haven for political dissidents and stuff like that. That's why Marx ended up there. And what was it like in the beginning of the 20th century, and why do you think so many Russians and Latvians ended up there? I mean, was there like a big, were they attracted because of the anarchist movement, or is it just because it was political freedom? And how do you think it changed them?
Yeah, I can answer that very easily. They came to England and Scotland generally, and London in particular, for a very simple reason. There was a large amount of shipping between Riga and other ports in Latvia, like Liepaja, and ports in England and Scotland. And successive waves of political refugees in the Baltic ended up in London simply because it was easy to get here. The method generally was to be smuggled aboard a merchant ship by sympathetic sailors, hidden in the coal bunker usually, and so sit in the coal bunker for 2 weeks, and to emerge totally black from head to foot when you arrived in London. And typically they would have the address of some, quite often it wasn't even Latvian, it could have been a Polish Socialist party, could be a Russian party, but they'd be given an address in Latvia of a friendly person or organisation in London to go to, and they'll sort you out from there. So there's a particular incident which I relate in the book, but that was they simply the first place they could get to easily, where they could live, where they could get socialist literature, where they could print it. So if they had a bit more money, they went on to America.
I just want to say one quick thing. Anybody correct me? Alien Registration Act. What year?
1905?
Yeah. Right. So the situation is changing a bit. So, you know, obviously, like I've got relatives, you know, EastEnders, my relatives are all from Poland and that. Probably Jewish, I don't know. But so there is this mass migration going on, but there is a reaction going on as well with the British state about this migration. And I believe that's the first sort of one of the periods of legislation appears at that moment. So it's not a straightforward story. It's probably partly why it's been smuggled as well. I mean, I think you could probably get to Britain easier prior to 1905, but there is some changing happening, which is starting to, like, you know, clamp down on these dangerous Eastern European foreigners, which was part of the narrative at the time. Peter the Payer probably didn't have to. Or having to that thing didn't help. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, it's a quick question. Do we know where the weapons that were used in Sydney Street, do we know where they came from? Sounds like in a lot of these stories you're talking about as a mass
Yes,
proliferation of
I could
weapons
also tell you
in
where they are now. In those days, it was quite legal to bring in weapons. You didn't need a license. So you didn't even have to smuggle them into England. You had to smuggle them into the Baltic from England, but you could bring them legally into England. You could basically just go into a gun shop, including in England, and buy guns. You
And that was
could walk
common
into a gun
practice.
shop in London and buy a Mauser.
A lot of people in London had guns at hand, did they?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And even the English left had more guns before the First World War than is generally known. When fights broke out between leftists, it wasn't uncommon for somebody to produce a revolver and stick it in your face and say, shut up. In terms of the guns that they were smuggling back into the Baltic, they brought them straight from the factory from the Mauser factory, the Browning factory, shipped them up in large consignments here, and then broke them down into smaller consignments and shipped them out. The particular guns from the Houndsditch murders and the siege of Sydney Street were in two places. The City of London Police Museum, which is in a police station in the City of London, and the Black Museum in Scotland Yard. So they're divided between those two places.
Right, I'm nicking the last question. I've been told to wind up here. So it just seems to be a very interesting story to me about this idea of where anarchism becomes arguably a serious current working class historically. And this moment in 1905, this example seems to me to show that. And I just wanted to ask about a couple of other moments in history which I relate to. One is the 1877 rail strike in the United States. If you want to look into American working class history, look at the 1877 rail strike. Well, it was a massive movement, but to be honest, put down by the armed force, brutal armed force, gun battles and also hundreds dying. And that's the moment where a large number of socialists in America can turn against the idea of using the state as a weapon to free the working class. And those people go on to become the people in Chicago who were behind the 8-hour day movement and the Haymarket Massacre, which produces May Day. Similarly, in Spain, in the very repressive period in the 1920s, and even under the Republic of the early 1930s, you see the rise of the anarchist movement. So I just wondered, Phil, you want to comment on where these moments in history where anarchism becomes a real force and not just a countercultural, subcultural relevance.
Yeah, I mean, the parallel with America is very good because the mafia really started off from by being employed by the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World.
Couldn't use a microphone, could
Can you
you?
use the mic, please?
Sorry. In America, the first person to employ people to employ the mafia really were the IWW, strangely enough.
Which are who, sorry?
Industrial Workers of the World.
Which is an industrial union as distinct from a trade union organised by industry. Because they were coming under so many armed attacks by vigilantes and armed mobs that were paid by their employers to attack the union members. They had no experience of guns themselves, so they employed the people who did, which is the mafia. And the mafia started off defending strikes against the employers, and then the employers started to notice this, and then gave them an offer they couldn't refuse, which is we'll pay you more to attack your employers in the IWW. And it's again a question of defensive violence of socialists and the working class against terrorism waged against them by the state or the employers. And the experience in Latvia is interesting to me because it's a real social struggle, a social and national struggle, social for social justice and national justice at the same time, that has mass support of the population, that during the course of that struggle, the struggle itself produced an anarchist movement. It wasn't the reverse, like it wasn't a revolutionary group that produced a revolution. The revolution produced the anarchists, which is the opposite of what basically happens today. The anarchists are trying to presumably start a revolution. Seems a bit long in coming, but it was the other way around then.
Right, that's great. I'd like to thank both the authors of the book who are here today. Would you like to stand up? Take a bow. Take a bow.